Okay, so these recordings are a bit of a shambles, but let me plod on. So I want to talk about politics right now, because I've made two recordings which will be up by the time that this recording is open, and this will be sort of the third recording in sort of going into Metatype and Metagram, but anyway, let me not distract myself. It's just that I haven't nicely defended some of my political arguments, which are somewhat necessary at this time in my country, at least, or at least to, well, I would like to get my opinion across to some commentators that have made noises and said things which I find. The guy on Morning Shot was citing Koos Malan, which is a kind of judicial scholar, and although I agree with a lot of their analysis, I think that how they are morally framing the argument is atrocious, and in some sense, it just shows, I think, shows a real insensitivity to a large scale problem. Which we're going to be facing. We're going to sort of repeat history if we don't sort of work out that the kind of constitution that South Africa has is, you can't do better than that, and it's worth defending, and in some sense you can even use it to get what you want, at least ideologically, I would say, in an ideological battle, and sort of dismissing it as being as saying that these are defects in the constitution, rather with the de facto betrayal of the constitution. And sort of, you can't conflate the constitution with the de facto constitutional order, which Koos Malan seems to, or at least that's what I get from at least hearing from it from Morning Shot, and also hearing other people like Phil Craig of the independence movement from sorry, I'm trying to think of what his organization is called. I think they just call it the CIAG, which I can't remember what it stands for, but essentially it's a lobbyist. Anyway, it's not important, but really incensed with some of what I consider to be their political insensitivity, or their ideological insensitivity, in just kind of taking shortcuts to seemingly, in some sense, I think the Constitution is the greatest ammunition and weapon that they could be to within the context of an independence movement, which would simultaneously exactly cast the right kind of division that needs to be made. In terms of, well, are you part of this corrupt moral corruption that is causing the country to fail, or yeah. So, anyway, so it could be cost. Anyway, this is this is not what this recording should be about. Sorry, I just needed to get that off the top of my brain, but I need to make a detailed recording about that at some point, which I will. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about Metagram now. Just check that didn't. It just revealed my bottom bar, I would say. I should have done that. Put it back. Yeah, I did. Okay, so anyway, I didn't want that black picture while I was just going from side to side. Anyway, okay, so let's talk about Metagram. What? So I'll just make a footnote here. So this is 4 minutes in. I'm in there, and I'm going to start the recording now. Okay, so close to 5 minutes. Okay, so Metagram, emotional tones. So let's start here. this is the 17 cognitive functions with the final 5. And 17 is written here twice. Let me show this diagram of it. Okay, so these are the 17 cognitive functions. Now, I can't show a proof for this. And in some sense, the proof for this is slightly, well, it's not a proof, but some evidence towards this ends up becoming a kind of, in terms of what elements should go where. But essentially, I discovered this. I didn't sort of dream of this, and then I sort of plotted this out by empirically witnessing cognitive functions. And, you know, I had very strange language when I tried to first sort of get at the core of this, but essentially I knew that there were 12 cognitive functions that were making up cognitive inflections, essentially. And I would call one the master regulator, and I would call the other one, I can't even think. But essentially, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to be able to substantiate this. Just describing it is hard enough. But essentially, if you empirically uncover that these cognitive functions are linked to one another, at least the pattern that I could see formed from this quite quickly was that no cognitive function is used twice. So one cognitive function belongs to one of these field circuits, these eagle, calf, man, lion. I call these field circuits. Field circuits, and they're each made up of 3 cognitive functions, and each 3 cognitive function is in a different container, as in the container being defined by between 2 final 5 entities. So between dimension 16, this green is dimension 16, and dimension 3, there is an anomaly here. This is the only, so you can see that, you know, sort of there's pink, there's brown, there's gray, there's pink, there's brown, there's gray. And here there's pink and brown in the same cleavage between these 2 final 5. That is strange, and it's interesting then that, you know, sort of it also marks the distinction between 17 and 1. So there is a kind of mechanical reason to think that this is the apex and this is the base in some sense. Okay. So this creates a special meta-ethical or existential conundrum, which is a mystery within spiritual or religious philosophy as well. I think that this, so dimension 16 I correlate to the Father. Dimension 3 I've never had such a, I can't find a scriptural, you know, sometimes I think, oh, is this the Lord God of hosts? I'll explain why the characteristic of dimension 3 perhaps lends itself to calling this the Lord God of hosts. But in some sense, dimension 17, 1 and 2 are very, very mental, as in they exist within the mind. Dimension 4 is, and this is slightly ironic, that alchemically dimension 4 is an air element, but in terms of the scriptural archetype that corresponds with dimension 4, I always consider dimension 4 the water. And I could quickly run through. So dimension 1 is the flesh, dimension 2 is the spirit, dimension 4 is the water, dimension 5 doesn't really maybe have one, maybe fire, dimension 6 is the salt, dimension 8 is the earth, and then from dimension 9 to 17, these, so in some sense 1 to 8 all sort of exist under the earth, and 9 to 17 is heaven. So dimension 9 is hope or discerning, or the gift of the apostle. Dimension 10 is trust, or the gift of the elder. This is dimension 11, which I think corresponds with the Holy Ghost. Dimension 12 is reason, or the light. Dimension 13 is faith, or the gift of the priest. Dimension 12 could also be linked to the deacon. Dimension 14 is the Son, or the Word. I usually just call it the Word. Dimension 15 is exuberance, also the gift of the evangelist, what things are. So this is the earth of, anyway, I'll talk about that soon. And dimension 17 is another earth element, which is tranquility, how things are, or how it is, or the gift of the prophet. And it's interesting because this corresponds quite neatly with Shinto Buddhism, in which they actually have, on their ceremonial dresses, they have 13 circles, sort of, almost looking like a partial sort of flower of life or something like that. But the 13 circles, I believe, actually corresponds to the eight spheres of earth and 9 spheres of heaven, which is also a Shinto, this doesn't, Shinto Buddhism essentially was Buddhism added to Shinto, into the ancient sort of Shinto mythology and worldview. And anyway, so they get the 8 spheres of earth and 9 spheres of heaven inherited from their Shinto, let's say, religious ancestry. And anyway, and the 13 circles as well comes from the Shinto. And the only way that you can get 9 and 8 out of the 13 circles is if you put a cross over the first row, because these are rows of 5 circles. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there are 4 on each side, and that's what makes so that would be 8 plus 5 is 13. Because it's got like 6 arms. So it's got a center circle with 6 arms of 2 circles going out. And if you put a cross over the line and just over the middle 2, the cross will cover 7 spheres, including the center sphere. And if you always, so you have to kind of do a rule. This is so unimportant. Oh my word, this is irrelevant. Talking about a symbol. But essentially, if you count all the spheres, but you only count the ones that don't append to the cross, and you always count the exception to the rule is that you always count the center circle. So you go through each arm and you count all the circles that aren't covered by the cross, but every time you move through the center, you count the center. You will end up counting the center circle 5 times, and you will count 8 transition, or 8 for the earth, and then if you only count the cross and ignore the other ones and go through each arm, then you'll count 9, and you'll go through the center circle 3 times in heaven and twice in the earth. I could have had a diagram for this, and that would have been a lot better to illustrate that, but it's actually really rather irrelevant. But anyway, and it's, you could call it a cross, you could call it the sword and the stone. It's interesting how perhaps a recurring motif, such far away, such a distant place from one to the other. Anyway, okay, so how to describe this? So if you have these 12 things like this, and the rule is that they can only be connecting different things. And then there's another rule, is that each of the corners of each triangle has to be a different element. And so if you just make that rule, I'm just saying on a technical level, if you want to make as few symbols as possible, the only way to do that by guaranteeing that each corner of each field circuit is made up of a different symbol, and you want the least number of symbols, the best you can do is 4. And anyway, so I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to sort of point out a kind of a technical feature of the structure here. And so, for example, here, let's look at the line. So the line is made up of dimension 15, dimension 1, and dimension 10. Okay, sorry, I should have explained the 4 alchemical elements. So, as you can see here, let's just focus on the ones with the alchemical symbols. As a shorthand, even in my Metagram circuitry notes, I will, because I only referred when I was discovering Metagram circuitry within people, I was not actually identifying particular cognitive functions. I was only identifying alchemical elements. And essentially, and that led me to some very strange conclusions that there were lots of different mechanics that were, so I had to find sort of the most lowest common denominator to track these things so that I could work out what the hell was going on, because it was confusing as hell. And so I would make empirical observations of people, essentially from a vast correlated experience and a vast data bank internal to me of just absorbing people's pattern of how they think, essentially. So, sort of using empathy and getting to know people from the inside out and how they sort of think, and getting enough insight into many different people, and then having a major manic episode so that I could collate all that data into a model, which was essentially my plan to do this research. A plan that I sort of hatched at 5 years old, although I realize how incredible that might sound. But anyway, I didn't do it all on my own, I would say. I did have help. But anyway, so what makes an earth element or a fire element or a water element is essentially this word in the formulation. So water elements are should elements. How things should be, that's the water element of sattva. Brown here is sattva, gray is rajas, and pink is tamas, just in terms of this color code. That's a kind of typology that Hinduism, guna literally means nature. So it's a way of classifying the nature of someone's personality, essentially. But it's essentially also material, it's the nature of material energy. And so in some sense, I'm going to define material energy as the ingredients of karma. So all of these will have a kind of karmic signature. And essentially because they will have a tendency to propitiate. Now, or sort of create reactions, chain reactions. But anyway, I'm going to get into that in a bit. Okay, so within a particular container between two final 5 things, there are going to be as many field circuits as there are items. So, you know, this is going to have 3 field circuits of 3 different circuits. So between these two final 5, you're going to have 3 different corners of 3 different field circuits. Here, there are going to be 2 different field circuits. It's going to be 1, and that is part of this section. It's going to be 3. That's between the green and the yellow is 3 over here. Now, let me just find a diagram. So I don't want to explain this yet. No, actually, it is time to explain that. Okay, so basically, if you take the field circuits and you kind of artistically mess with them, this is an altered. It should look like this is what it actually looks like, but I messed with these triangles just to show how they fall. I'm just kind of conflating things so that they converge in the middle between these 2 things to show that here you've got 3 field circuits that are all found in between these 2 things. Now, what's interesting is that when, for example, if you look at the yellow triangle and you look at the blue triangle, that they both have corners in both between the green and the yellow and between the yellow and the red. That this yellow corner and this blue corner and this yellow corner and this blue corner is doing the same thing. Now, I call that a correspondence or a symmetry. Yeah, so I call that a symmetry, and I have it. I don't have proof for this essentially, but I believe that when a thinker is deciding to use the emotional tones which are symbolized by the connection between these 2 things, they naturally can, when they're using the yellow triangle connection between these two containers, the containers being bordered and created by the final 5, that there's a realization, or there's a natural understanding, or a kind of an implicit proclivity that when one is using one karmic flow or one emotional tone, like let's say the yellow, then you know that you could be using the blue, or that the yellow and the blue come as a kind of joint package. They are both options. They're both, in some sense, they exist in the same mind space. Okay. Now, you know, so you could call it a kind of a natural implication. Okay, so now there's another kind of symmetry which is just becomes a resultant of these symbols themselves, that essentially some emotional tone somewhere is going to be a square to a triangle, and somewhere else there's going to be another square and connected to another triangle. And I call that a kind of either a mechanical symmetry or an inverted symmetry. And so, I call them alchemical symmetries and alchemical inverted symmetries. And this is essentially a complete list of, actually, these are just, yeah, so the final 5, okay, so this is just mechanical symmetries. And then also the container symmetries are being being symbolized by the 5-pointed star. So this has got a red 5-pointed star, 6 to 13, which is, I'm going to have to explain this, why 6 to 13 is both condescending and bored. 6 to 13, the connection of 6 to 13, which is a red. Actually, it doesn't specify here. Sorry, for me to actually see it, I would have to look at this diagram. 6 to 13 is eagle. Condescending and bored. Let's see, is the same as 4 to 12. The 6 to 13 is the same as 4 to 12. Sorry, did I get the, yeah, it is 6 to 13 and 4 to 12. So 6 to 13 is eagle and 4 to 12 is man. So 6 is being connected to 13 over here, which is the blue connection, and 4 is going to 12, which is this red connection here. Obviously, I've warped these triangles just to show that essentially actually it was written on this diagram. It's written over here that man is 4 to 12 and eagle is 6 to 13, and that is symbolized by the red 5-pointed star. So anyway, so that means that these things are symmetrical in terms of the final 5. So I believe that means that they are both considered simultaneously, or that one is mindful, one is almost naturally mindful of that when you are condescending or bored, you are going to be naturally mindful that in the same breath you could be silly or excited. It is kind of, it's in the same vicinity, it's in the same arena of, it's the same character of consciousness that is going to decide to use the one or the other. The quality of the thinker is going to be a certain way, or kind of the phenomenological sort of internal driver that chooses this thing. Sorry, this is being a bit weak with terminology here, but okay, so that's important. And then the other things that, so that is just something that I've put on top of this. Whereas actually what this whole thing is actually showing is the mechanical symmetries. So for example, both 13 and 4 are air elements, and both 17 and 12 are earth elements. And so what that means is that if you're silly or excited, it's going to sort of mechanically rub up against or displace being worried or annoyed. Or there's going to be a kind of symmetry that if you're going to be excited, there's going to be a kind of implicit annoyed tone, that there's going to be a natural sympathy, a mechanical sympathy between these two things. And there's also going to be a mechanical sympathy between these two things. That if you're being silly, there is actually a kind of mindfulness about being worried. And if you're being annoyed, there's a mindfulness about what would be excited. That there's a kind of, in some sense you could say, well, the definition of being silly is that you have a handle on what you're worried about. You in some sense are simultaneous. So this is a more tenuous connection. These mechanical symmetries are like very, very, you could call it sort of karmic. It's out there. It's almost it's almost part of the unconscious domain, if I were to import some insight from metatype and the unconscious side of the mind. These are sort of grooves, karmic grooves, which just kind of make up the narrative of life. Like I've often said, that if you can understand this stuff, you will understand all the ingredients of archetype. These are the main constituents of archetypes, essentially. Now, what's also interesting is the inverted symmetries. Of which there's only one this blue star is an inverted symmetry of the final five. All the other symmetries are not inverted. The blue one is inverted, which is quite strange. Inverted symmetries are very interesting because that basically means that you can't get away with positivity. You can, you get these people, for instance, like within, I don't even want to call them spiritual life, where they're like positivity people, they're like, do affirmations, build yourself up, be kind to yourself. And obviously there's something in that, but you can't avoid judgment. It's not possible for this basic reason, because of these inverted symmetries. Sorry, this is the complicated stuff. I'm going to return to this for a second, but just for me to complete the point that I want to make, I have to talk about the field circuits themselves. So the actual triangles themselves, this is repeated just to show that it goes in a flow. So each field circuit has its own has its own arrow. So the actual triangle itself is not, it's not just it actually has a kind of, it has a circulation, almost like the, in what's it called, Qigong. In Qigong healing, which I've always thought that Qigong is, if there was any healing modality that I believe is consistent with Christian doctrine, it's Qigong, because Qigong is not about invasively doing anything to you. It's about observing you. It's actually saying, I'm judging you and I'm looking at you and this is what I see. And in some sense, it's just communicating what I see. And it's for you to fix yourself. In some sense, Qigong is very much a kind of, it's there to propitiate a kind of self-healing in some sense, by just awareness, by conscious awareness, in some sense, by trying to communicate something about internal circulation. But anyway, that's, I mean, it's the same thing with acupuncture as well. I mean, acupuncture is not, it's not being done to you. In some sense, it's just helping your internal things connect up. It's all about essentially managing stagnation, generally speaking, and opening channels within yourself, as it were, but using a kind of physical propitiation. So in some sense, that is certainly kind of somewhat more invasive. I mean, what's also interesting is in acupressure is the forebearer of and in acupressure, people manually would just use their hands, and they would essentially, even cause pain, because it's like you don't heal if you don't sort of break things down, perhaps, or even bring some kind of acute tension. And there's a lot of, anyway, I mean, this can also be culturally bound up into certain things that are going on in certain societies and certain individuals and certain personalities that interface with these sorts of things. But many people are very repressed in their emotions in a lot of sense, because they're very disconnected from their own. Anyway, I do think that a lot of these things have correlates to potentially, I mean, famously, even in Western empiricism, the original empirical medicine of the humors, and the biles, were basically theories of balance and theories of a kind of psychosocial even elements to them. Like sometimes you would be prescribed not even to change your pattern, but to go and have a particular kind of conversation with someone. I mean, I'm not even joking, but it just kind of shows how holistic even it was in the West for a time. And that happened under the banner of empiricism. That was actually, anyway. So this is just showing the three cognitive functions in the Jungian notation. That make up this field circuit. So man is made up of dimension 4, dimension 12, and dimension 9. And okay, so I need to explain these arrows now. So 4 and 12 are not on equal footing. The first number is the base of that corner. The second number is going in the direction of the arrow, because you know there's one direction in a field circuit. There's not two directions, there's only one direction. So as 4 is going to 12, if 4 is being, so the base of the cognitive function is 4. If 12 is going along and helping 4, you're being silly. Sorry, actually I just said the wrong thing. If 12 is being negated, so if 4 is being expressed in the absence of dimension 12, and in some sense 4 is displacing 12, 12 is conspicuously absent from the expression of 4, that means that you're being silly. So I've got here, these are, this was, I don't know if this still has a date on, no, this was, I wrote this in 2013. Shows how sort of long this has gone on, but silly, here we go. So moderation is dimension 4, liberty is dimension 12, are those sort of one word titles, which I forgot to mention when I was trying to mention all the 12 anyway. Experiencing what things should be like, that refers to moderation, distinguished by an absent grasp of why those things are a particular way. Why things are a particular way, that corresponds to liberty. Which, if I could say that liberty, so liberty is why it is, why things are, or why it is, and moderation is what ought be or what would be. Now, you'll notice that when I've translated the long form of moderation into a sentence here, I've actually said experiencing what things should be like. So I haven't used the word would. And this is because language is difficult, at least when I'm trying to. So I'm going to have to make a technical note here to explain this. I hate explaining this because it really makes people's, I can imagine it makes people glaze over. When you read something, the writing is speaking to you as a different person. This is not prose. You're not reading this as a first person. So my long forms are written in the first person. What ought be is moderation. This is being written in the frame of talking to you in this. So if I want to know from you, in language, should and would, or should and ought, I take would and ought to be synonyms. Should and ought changes depending on if it's, for example, if you ask someone a question. So if you want to know what someone thinks we should do, so this gets so technical, it's so horrible to go over this. Let's just say we're in danger and it's an emergency and something has to happen very quickly. So you want to know, you see, so it's perhaps also ambiguous depending on how grammatically correct people are going to be. So I mean, I've just made it an emergency, which means that in some sense the grammar is going to be overlooked anyway because the actual underlying meaning is what's going to be looked at. But and it also makes a difference between what and how and why in terms of, see, moderation is such a basic, it's the fourth dimension of psychological reality, and it's, in some sense, that is the opening of the field of action. It all starts with moderation. Like the first three dimensions, at least between the father and the third dimension, those are all essentially in the mind. This kind of enters into sort of the field of action. Okay, let me make my horrible example. So essentially the thing to contrast with moderation is trust, because trust is actually what should be, which I will have written here in the form of, the long form of trust within my work is what things should be like, or what should be. The reason why I say like is all the dimensions that have what in them, it's a bit clunky just to use, not to add like. So what it is, or what is it like. Here I've actually used it, experiencing a sense of what things mean, because you kind of have to add a qualifier to what, because otherwise it's a bit too generic and vague anyway. But this would and should thing that I'm trying to explain is I've done this for all of the water and air elements. So trust is, I've got written here, experiencing a sense of what things would be like. But the actual long form of trust, when I write it out in the subjective first person, is what things should be, or what should be. So your sense of what should be, I've got here sort of expressed as experiencing a sense of what things would be like. Because your subjective sense of what should be, if you were to report that to a third person, you would say, oh, that's what I thought it would have been like, because I thought that that's what it should be. So when you're referring to your subjective state of mind, you speak in the first person, like I just kind of expressed it there. But when you are relaying it for somebody else as a tentative, almost invitation to emulate the thinking themselves, in some sense, to be polite, you use the word, in some sense, you don't pretentiously ask, what should we do today, as if to presume, as if to be presumptuous. You say, what ought we do today? So you can tell me what you think should be done. Anyway, okay, so that was a bit of a massacre, but anyway, let me just continue. Okay, so yeah, this stuff is really... Okay, so anyway, the main point that I'm trying to get into here is that the fourth dimension of psychological reality in this field circuit, when this is being expressed in the absence, or in the overshadowing of dimension 12, you're being silly. And when you're excited, it's both. But 12 is overrepresented. So I've got this expressed within my... so here, excited will be over here. Experiencing a sense of what things should be like, distinguished by a stronger grasp of why those things are a particular way. So that corresponds to the liberty. So you can see that I've made a notation here, which is that moderation is always the first one is positive. You see, they're both positive. but liberty is great. Moderation is smaller than liberty, which is also positive. But here, liberty is negative because it's absent. So the moderation is distinguished by an absent grasp of why those things are a particular way, and that is to be silly. And here the moderation is distinguished by a stronger grasp of why those things are a particular way. So the dimension 12 is more than the dimension 4, but they're both happening together. And this will have a propensity essentially to produce caution. So this is how the karmic field circuits work, is that if you're silly or cautious or shy, and you don't transmute that into these higher ones. So if you're silly and you never become excited, you're not going to become cautious. But if you become excited, you are likely to transition over into being cautious. This is likely to be a sequitur. Or you're going to do this to other people. If you are just projecting, when I say projecting, I mean you are exhibiting or expressing the excited emotional tone. If that's all you do around other people, you are going to propitiate a kind of sympathetic cautiousness by other people. If you make a kind of community amalgamation, if you create a kind of an organizational energy flow or whatever, this is going to be a natural, because this is potential energy for being cautious. And then essentially, if you can transmutate that caution into being shocked, then that's going to lead you into being shy, and then you'll be shy forever until you're relaxed, and then relaxed will be able to will be the potential of becoming silly. So these top ones are always the potential for precipitating the next one. And I also think that they can also create what I would even consider to be toxic, although other people might consider them to be positive tones, that you could just actually create a daisy chain of being excited, shocked, and relaxed. So if you can be these things simultaneously, they can reinforce each other. If you can be in equal parts excited and shocked and relaxed simultaneously, you can sustain a flow of positive energy within the field circuit. Now, the thing is that a lot of these affirmation gurus, what I think they're doing is they're creating essentially a kind of rationalization that lets them play this kind of game. The problem that this produces is that you're going to get a very rigid field circuit. By the way, so this group of 6 is one field circuit. This is one field circuit. This is just sort of laid out in definitional tones, in definitional subcomponents. My definitions of the cognitive functions there. Anyway. Now, what isn't shown in this graph or in this table is how the field circuits correspond to one another through sympathy propitiation or through the symmetries or the inverted symmetries. But because of symmetries and inverted symmetries, a positive flow of energy in one field circuit is going to imply, with it can't be avoided, is going to imply the negative emotional tones of another field circuit because of an inverted symmetry. So, you can use these to hold potential energy within your field circuit. But if it's not balanced with with negative judgments, with these negative judgments, I like to think that these are sort of where judgment is in these inhibitory. These lower ones are inhibitory. These ones are holding potential charge. Now, you need a combination of both, because if you're not inhibited, there's going to be no structure. There's going to be it's not going to be sustainable. But essentially, you're going to have to hold on to this potential energy in such a vicious way, in such an in such a lopsided way that you're going to have to steal energy from the from another field circuit that is invertedly correlated. You're going to end up being a vampire on another field circuit. So the only way to sustain positive energy without it being properly balanced internal to the field circuit is that another field circuit is going to get gummed up. You're going to have to use another field circuit to prop up the potential energy that's flowing in the one circuit. So you're basically going to be stealing from Paul to pay Peter, or whatever the phrase is, you know. Anyway, okay, so now where this is actually happening is very interesting. And I haven't yet explained what the 4 pointed stars are, so I'm really jumping around so much. Okay, so just by the way, so this is a summary of all the symmetries and asymmetries. But I don't have a key here, so I'll just tell you what they are. So obviously the 5 pointed stars are symmetries except for the blue one. The blue 5 pointed star is asymmetrical, which means that when 5 is going to 2, if you're being rushed, right? If you're, sorry, not being rushed, if you are stylistically in the emotional tone of rushed, which is 5 with an absence, which is, what do I call this? What is my, is prudence. 5 is prudence, and 2 I call placidity. Okay, so if you are prudent with, you see, this is why I made the one word things, just as a kind of shorthand. So if you have prudence with an absence of placidity, you are rushed. And 17 is tranquility, and 6 is eminence. So if you are rushed, that actually is going to line up with being calm. Which, so the more rushed you are, prudence with an absence of placidity, the more eminence you have that is overpowering tranquility. So the more rushed you are, the more calm you are. I know it sounds slightly counterintuitive, but essentially because rushed here has a very particular meaning in terms of essentially obviating placidity, whereas calm has both of these things, but the eminence is being overpowered by the tranquility. So it's calmness is really, in some sense, this is a kind of confidence. This is almost a kind of self-investment into your own salt, more so than even the general state of things. In terms of how things are. 17 is how things are. Dimension 6 is why things should be. This is the water element of Rajas. Sorry, I shouldn't even say that. It's just confusing to add that layer. But anyway, and when you are lazy, that's going to sort of sympathetically trigger being eager. Or in some sense, this is, when I say sympathetically trigger, I mean that there's an implicit sympathy here. I'm not thinking of the right word, but essentially this is not that this is causing that, but it's sort of like this is on the same wavelength. That this is that there's an implicit symmetry between these things occurring, that in some sense rushed people have a calmness about them, but it's kind of like you kind of have to sort of, this is an unconscious symmetry, if I could phrase it like that. This is a participatory, mechanical, virtual overlay, okay? And in some sense it's very easy for people, I believe, therefore, to convert or to translate the one into the other. It's very easy to convert this, essentially. Because in some sense the ingredients or the mechanical space for it is kind of the segue is naturally there. Just in terms of its own internal structure, is ends up being the same. Or here, the structure, the shared structure, is the final five. So is that they share the same sort of final five symmetry. Anyway, so this is actually not a mechanical one. This is on the realm of the conscious thinker, is seeing this parallel. And this, because this is the conscious thinker inverted symmetry doing this. Anyway, I'm going to, okay, and sorry, I really want to get to talking about this, but let me just say, so if the alchemical symbol, this is meant to be all the alchemical symbols laid in one another, which is sort of the philosopher's stone symbol. Anyway, this means that that's an alchemical symmetry. So this is a mechanical symmetry. This, I just used the six-pointed star on top of this just to mean that this is an inverted mechanical, alchemical inversion here. So in the same way that these are inverted, these are also inverted. So if you are lazy, it's the same as being lonely, and if you are terrified, it's the same as being calm. And then I realized, well, how can you be calm and terrified? That doesn't seem to make sense. But again, these things have a kind of very particular sort of meaning. So to be terrified here is that you have trust with an absence of exuberance. So, in some sense, this being terrified in this way does not essentially mean I guess you would actually be kind of prone to being sort of frightened. Anyway, and being lonely is having exuberance, a stronger amount of exuberance over your trust. So you have a greater appreciation of what things mean or what things are, that is overpowering your sense of trust, which is what things should be. So if you think that what things are is overpowering to your sense of what things should be, then you're lonely. And if you have an absent sense of what things are, and you only have a sense of trust that is in some sense overshadowing or displacing what things are, then you are terrified. Yes, just remember. So being terrified is going to be corresponded with being calm. Being lazy is going to be corresponded with being lonely. So I think that essentially what this inverse symmetry is basically showing is that, and this is quite an important point potentially for therapy, or for even just being perhaps good at counseling, maybe. Like this is a kind of way to technically understand counseling perhaps as well, is that you could use this as a way to work on people if you can identify that they are terrified about something or lonely about something according to this definition. Instead of trying to manage that directly, you could essentially work on this, because you could work out that there is potentially a sympathetic version of what's going on here over here in virtual, in this kind of, so in some sense this is a kind of I guess the word reframing, this is a kind of a natural reframing. But in some sense, reframing, in psychology is also kind of useless to a large extent. sort of, especially if you start using it for everything, because essentially a better way to deal with things is just within the field circuit itself. Because there's going to be an imbalance with, if you do have an imbalance with anything, you're going to have an imbalance in the field circuit. But it might, some sense, the field circuit might not be what's the problem. You might have a virtual problem which is causing this to be stagnant, is being impinged on by this, essentially. That you're so calm about something, and that is creating a virtual being terrified about something else. A kind of, in some sense, this can be a kind of compensatory implication, because these things are sort of feeding each other. Now, anyway, the reason why these have 4 stars on them is because I believe that these 4-star things are prone to being gummed up more than other things, because they have less interfaces with other things. So everything by definition will have something leading to it within its own field circuit, and the next corner of the field circuit that it leads onto. So everything is always a corner of a triangle in a field circuit. But then you have these other things which are symmetries and asymmetries. Now, everything, you see, like this guy, this corner of the man field circuit, 4 to 12, has got a mechanical symmetry with this, and it's got a final 5 symmetry with that. This, on the other hand, has nothing. This is just in a field circuit. This is only connected to its own field circuit. This, I say that, that's a lie. It's also connected to man over this alchemical. So it's only connected to one thing, and that one thing is also mechanical. It's not based on the final 5. It's purely mechanical. So the reason why I call these, why I've pointed out these 4-star things, is because they only have mechanical things, and they only have one connection. So they only have mechanical connections to stuff. And so I think that these are the games that sophists play. This, I think, is where a lot of bullshit is hidden. This is where a lot of, where people create technical, I mean, you can also use this stuff maybe to do some interesting work, because in some sense everyone is, I like to think that this has something to do with atheists, and this has something to do with, anyway, I think that, because if you, for example, have I haven't talked about metagram circuits properly yet, but if you have metagram circuitry that involves some of these emotional tones, this means that I think you're capable of being programmed like a robot, because all you need to do is sympathetically drag yourself and associate yourself with something else, and you can just kind of jump on the bandwagon. You can just kind of follow the tide of some technical sweetness, of some technical symmetry of something, because this is your node in it. And also, I think that this is where a lot of stagnation, I think, can build up, because this is kind of, the less connections that something has, the more pivotal it is, potentially. So I think that if there's going to be cognitive dissonance, it is going to have a tendency to accumulate in these 4-star things. But that's a really sort of, that's, I think, that you shouldn't make general rules like that. It's almost like a thumb suck. I don't want to make that, that's not a rule of the system. I'm just pointing this out, that I think that people that use these emotional tones, I think, are very capable of being either kind of ideologically captured by their own sort of reductive nonsense or their own rationalization. They can get into mechanistic sort of interfaces with things, and they can't sort of see past them. Anyway, because they are so obsessed with how this converts to that, they know that this converts to that, and because they know that there's a conversion at the base of it, they use that as a template of rationalization, which they think the whole life, the whole experience of everything can kind of fit into a similar kind of unimatrix, because they've got a part of their life which they know for damn sure how it works, and it's mechanical, and they've lived with it their whole life. They know that that there's some element of psychology which is basically can become a rigorous kind of mechanical thing. And so, the final five stuff is much more personable. It's much more internally, subjectively relatable, and in some sense it's much more grounded in that sense. Anyway, so this is an interesting thing here, where these things are actually, it's quite interesting. These things have both. There's a final five symmetry here, and there's an inverted mechanical symmetry here, which means that you can, in some sense, you can be shy is going to create a kind of, being shy and sad is going to be subjectively the same thing as and in the same way being relaxed and being relieved is going to be subjectively the same, but mechanically it's inverted, that if you're shy there's going to be kind of a virtual implication that you are also kind of maybe relieved about something in some virtual sense. Like, I know that maybe that sounds too clunky. I need to explain this a bit better. But and if you are relaxed, that you are virtually potentially sad about something. That in some sense you can, you see, like this mechanical inversion stuff is kind of like. By the way, I think the inversions can also work two ways. I'm talking slightly fast and loose here. But because you see, like, when you are being sad, you are inhibiting the car field circuit is going to sort of gravitate towards this. There's going to be less potential energy on being relieved, essentially. And so you're kind of slowing down the car field circuit. Whereas if you are taking the inverse symmetry here, your man field circuit is gaining potential energy in the via a mechanical sympathy. If the mechanical sympathy, so if you're sad about something, it means that implicitly or virtually you have been so relaxed about something that you could be sad about it, because in some sense it's I think the word is leverage. In some sense the sadness is inversely leveraged or hedged by being relaxed about something, because you can't be sad unless you, in some sense, there's a potential of being relaxed. That's kind of what this mechanical inversion means. So, but in some sense, I don't think you necessarily experience being relaxed, but you have. It's a virtual correlate. It's an implicit correlate, but it's not. It's like within a. It's not like you are relaxed while you are sad. It's like you could be relaxed. There's an implication about how you could be relaxed, which is complicit with the sadness. So yeah, I need to work out better terminology for this stuff. I apologize, but okay. So that's kind of how this works, and obviously that's for the mechanical one. Obviously the final five, inversion and symmetrical inverse symmetry and also the final five normal symmetries, are also different to the mechanical symmetries. They are phenomenologically experienced differently, and they probably have, I'm going to have to sort of refine this at some point, but in some sense, that's part of my refinement of metagram circuitry. Okay, so these field circuits, this is so also what I think happens within the field circuits is that if you are inhibited because, let's say, on the line field circuit you're bashful, I think that that is also going to have a tendency of promoting being confused and promoting being terrified, because the less anxious you are, the less you're going to feed this. So in some sense, the less flow you have from here to here, you're going to have like less energy to potentially be transmuted into being angry. Although you could also be getting potential energy from another field circuit. Anyway, so I'm just basically saying that I think that if you are anxious, that, yeah, I mean, I do think that we will have a natural inclination or a tendency towards wanting, or perhaps we haven't, some people haven't discovered it yet, but you know, you can really stabilize these things if you just do them simultaneously, essentially. And that's also how I think you transcend karma, is that, you know, and I mean, there are lots of writings about this in the Gita, you know, where it talks about, you know, you have to sort of, you know, this is in the Tao, this is all over the place as well, you know, sort of you have to see the rest in activity and the activity in rest, and you have to see the man, this is bad that I can't remember exactly all the, and this is all over the where it's describing essentially the transcendental energy as opposed to karmic energy, and anyway, in some sense, I think that in the Christian scripture, it's framed in a much deeper way, because in some sense karma is not mentioned, or it's not described like it is in other religions. It actually says that the world is not made, in a sense, out of the material energy that is, for example, defined and described in Hinduism in the Gita, but it actually says that it's the temporal nature of the world which makes it fleshly, essentially. And that opens the scope to judgment. You know, people actually have a completely wrong conception that Christianity is against judgment. It does not say do not judge. That's not what it says in the scripture. It says judge not lest ye be judged. It is just saying judgment is a double-edged sword. And anyway, so sorry, this is just a way to, this is a useful way to see what's going on here. So the reason why they're duplicates here, and this is actually, I think, quite interesting, because this could also be used to map out metagram circuitry to some degree. So people, I'll try and fix my notes so I can present on them as well, but essentially people will have emotional tone, a emotional tone or two emotional tones in each foundation of each side of the mind. And they will kind of be distanced from one another, except for the emergent response is reciprocal to the primary counteroffer. So if your emergent response is this, if your emergent response is this, then your primary counteroffer will be this, and vice versa. Which is slightly confusing if there's more than one emergent response, because some people have more than one emergent response. They have two tones, and then they only have one primary counteroffer. And so in some sense, that's because essentially one of them is the prime reciprocal, and the other one is a symmetry, which is why it's lighting up, because it's just symmetrical. And this is also what I think might also inform certain types of psychopathology, like perhaps schizophrenia, is that actually the primary correlate has not been developed. Instead, what's been developed is one of the distant ones, and so you have a kind of disembodied connection between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response. And so you actually have a kind of a disembodied surrogate that is connecting you to your own metagram circuitry. And so your metatype is experiencing an environmental avatar that is helping you complete the circuit of your metagram emotional tone circuitry. Anyway, so anyway, the reason why I've got it linked like this is because you see this is just a mirror of eagle connects to line and calf, eagle connects to line. So this is just to show that, you know, someone's circuitry on their own, false ego complex could be mapped out within this. And then you could also duplicate this and say, well, this is another human being that has their personality on it. And then you can almost imagine how they would commingle, how they would share. You could use this in some sense to map psychological territory of groups of people and sort of make an aggregate of what's going on within a group of people, you know. And in some sense, I also think that some people, what could also be happening with certain types of psychopathology, like borderline personality disorder or narcissism, or perhaps just badly developed or juvenile individuals, what they could actually have is that they are themselves not even connected to their own circuitry within one iteration, within one frame. They're actually, that this line is doing something, and then this line is doing something different. And they actually have to have two full cycles to come full circle within their own metagram circuitry, because they are depending on an exogenous or an external way station. They are dependent on some kind of propitiative environmental sequitur in their chain of internal circuitry. So you could also use that some people that are basically discombobulated, this could be used in some sense to track a chain of thinking, or I have another diagram. Yeah, so you see, like, you could just have it, put it out like a, so someone could actually have you know, like a circumlocate, what's it called when people go around the earth, anyway, that essentially that they could actually, and I think that this might be connected to some degree perhaps to, you know, some personality, you know, like dissociative identity disorder and things like that, could perhaps be modeled on things like this, that you could have essentially different constellations and how they are being translated in some sense, that they are slightly, each personality or each alter has its own environmental terrain, and therefore in the presence of that propitiative element or catalyst, you switch into that configuration, because you've actually created essentially, or I do think that all of these problems could either be related, either between toxicity between the subconscious and the unconscious, but essentially that the problem is essentially probably that the subconscious and the ego are not well hand in glove, essentially. Anyway, that follows on from stuff that I was talking about in my last recording. Anyway, you know, this is not going very well with these recordings, but it was always going to be this messy, I think, actually. So this is just a diagram that has all of the information sort of condensed onto it. Not that useful. So actually, it's not all the information, because it doesn't have the final 5 symmetries, and that's the mechanical symmetries, basically, what I call the guna symmetries and inverted guna symmetries. So guna relates to sattva, rajas, and tamas, which relates to the alchemical symbols, essentially. Not exactly, but I should actually give a proper discourse about the gunas. Actually, quickly show a picture. This is a very old picture. I need to sort of make this look a bit better, but I'm using some old constructions. So instead of should, I use shall here, and then the air functions I put in these sort of pentagons. So the opinion is always an earth function, the notion is always a fire function, the spirit is always a water function, and the air function. And so actually, is this? Oh, I don't know, it's all correct. Anyway, this is probably not, this needs to sort of be, anyway, that's probably going to be confusing, but that's just essentially extracting, this is an extraction of the 17, from the 17 dimensions, taking out the 12 and grouping them together in those colors. Grouping these colors together, but putting them in the same order of earth, fire, water, and air. This is the fire element, this is the water element, this is the earth, and that's the air of sattva. Anyway, in some sense, it's almost not even worth me talking about the gunas, because in some sense this is much more important, and in some sense this is actually relevant to the mind. This is relatable. If you just talk about the gunas abstractly and you're stacking them in their own, in some sense the only thing that 12 model was showing is this is basically a way of understanding the divided line, because in some sense each of these is a section of the divided line, and then it kind of even goes down forever within itself. And this is, I call this sort of the infernal model of the world, because this is how the world looks according to karma. This is essentially a never-ending sort of karmic abyss that you zoom into it, and then you appear sort of it all sort of, it's like Russian dolls. You open the doll and there's a smaller one inside, and you open that one up and there's a smaller one inside, and you open that one up. This is a kind of Russian doll model, and the problem is that if you treat them like that, then you actually completely lose sight of the 17 dimensions, which is actually relevant to self-actualization and relevant to essentially the metatype stuff. Oh my word, this is. If you just look at them, if you just look at emotional tones, you won't see any of this. So you kind of have to sort of do both, essentially, or at least understand how that is plugged in or being caused by this. This is sort of the actual sort of prime cause. Anyway, I think that's been long enough. We're at an hour and a half almost. Hour and 20 minutes.